We hope you enjoy the following video presentation sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to equip and encourage Christians to live their faith within the world of ideas and arts. To help us continue to host events and make videos like this one, please make a donation after viewing the video by going to www.cslewis.org or clicking the link below. Thank you.
Many of us in the Christian world, especially in the U.S., have noticed the passing of a number of great figures from the stage. Perhaps for me, most notably, the great Chuck Colson, who was a friend and mentor and hero to me. And it was because Chuck spoke in 1998 that I learned about these Oxbridge conferences. And as these great figures have moved from the stage, I know many of us have been asking, who will replace them? Will anyone replace them? Will this be a faceless generation? That appeals to some kind of false sense of evangelical egalitarianism. We love certain scriptures. God is no respecter of persons, you know. But we misinterpret that because if God's no respecter of persons, it means he loves the great and brilliant as much as the cobbler and the fishwife. We shouldn't forget that. Greg Thornbury is indeed a fishwife and a cobbler. And I'm sorry, but on short notice, he's the best Stan and I could do. But I believe God can even use Greg. The reality is that, and I say this with also zero hyperbole, that Joe LeConte and Greg Thornbury are two of these new voices that the Lord is raising up. And you can test me on this. We can talk 10 years from now, and you can see whether I was right. But Greg Thornbury he's one of those voices. Practically speaking, he is currently the president of the King's College in New York City. I can say with tremendous joy that not only is he qualified for that position, but I would also go out on a limb with this and say that I believe he was created by the Lord to be the president of the King's College, and that there are things happening there now and that will happen in the future that the Lord has ordained and for which the Lord has created Greg to oversee and shepherd. It's my tremendous joy to call him a very dear friend. I wish I could say the same for Joe LeConte, but I don't even like him. Greg was the professor of philosophy and the dean of the School of Theology and vice president for spiritual life at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. He was there for a long time and got to know many important people who have known that he would amount to something and who have been his mentors and friends. And I know they were tremendously sad to see him go to King's. He's also the author of a book, Recovering Classic Evangelicalism, Applying the Wisdom and Vision of Carl F.H. Henry. He has written much more than that, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but in introducing Greg, let me just close by quoting, I believe it's Rochefoucauld, who said, "Holy cow, we're in for a great treat." Greg Thornbury.
I am Greg Thornbury from the King's College in New York City. I've just passed the 1-year mark of being president of that great institution. They're situated on Wall Street as we seek to give students of Christian conviction access to the strategic public and private institutions that shape culture. Right there in what J2P2, Pope John Paul II, that's my shorthand, once called the capital of planet Earth. So I've just passed the 1-year mark, and 1 year ago, I got a lot of Twitter comments on the appointment of my announcement. "Oh, they've elected Harry Potter as president of the King's College." I'll take it. I'll take it. What a joy it is to be here to be on this dais, this historic place, as we've heard, to follow that magnificent thing we saw last night with Max McLean. My goodness. And I just want to say a special word, echoing what Kelly Monroe Kohlberg and Eric have said, about the love that it takes from a man like Stan Matson to mount an event such as this. It comes out of a deep, abiding love for Jesus, and we need to spend days on end thanking him for giving us this opportunity to be together. It's incredible. Thank you, Stan. May Jesus be praised in all that we do. I've entitled my talk for today, Christian Virtues That Inspire Atheist Philosophers, which seems like an improbable topic, given the fact that to listen to the most of the so-called new atheists of our time, Christians are always either insane or stupid, or both, to quote Richard Dawkins. Religion is evil, Christians are a threat to society, Frank Schaeffer has daddy issues, and whatnot. But just to be clear, and to clear the air here with you this morning, I have zero interest in rehearsing the tired, hackneyed, and careworn ideas of this overexposed, beyond all propriety and reason group of media atheists. Instead, what I want to show you today is that if you look closely enough, you will see moments of real candor among those who do not profess our shared faith. There are streams of white light in darkened corners out there. For example, some time ago, I heard Yaroslav Pelikan, that great expositor of creeds, relate the story of how Stephen Jay Gould was once asked about what messages we should broadcast in space in order to reach out to intelligent life on other planets. Now keep in mind that this is the same Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist, the theorist behind the punctuated theory of equilibrium of evolution. An avowed atheist, he was also a devoted member of the Handel and Haydn Society of Boston. And so Gould could not hesitate in answering the question of what message we should convey to aliens. We should play Bach's Mass in B minor and say in as many languages as we can, this is the best we have ever done, and we would like for you to hear it, and we would like to hear the best that you have done. And so he would want to broadcast all across our solar system and universe Bach's B minor Mass, including the Credo in Unum Deum. I believe in one God. And all of a sudden you see, just for a moment, Gould's proposal of non-overlapping magisteria starts to muddy up a little bit and starts to overlap. So what I'm wondering today, as we talk together, is whether it's actually possible to take an atheist at face value. Perhaps some gentle resistance is warranted on our part. Perhaps the next time you meet a self-avowed atheist, the first thing that you should say is this: O ye of little non-faith. Think about it. We must learn to calmly and firmly subvert the myth of religious neutrality. As my friend David Dark likes to say, life's too short to pretend that we are not all religious. What does it mean to be religious anyway? Well, as Herman Dooyeweerd might have put it, who Francis Schaeffer called Herman Dooyeweerd, and it was Dooyeweerd, he defined religion as the belief in something or other as divine. And divine is defined as something that has the status of not being dependent on anything else. And so the sum of the matter is that everyone out there has something like that in their noodle, in their cephalic index, their worldview. Now, if I don't miss my guess, I think that everyone in this room has already gotten their fill, up to here, of the cold, stiff, unyielding, crush everything in your path, progressivist ideology. And for those of us in the United States, I'm afraid that there is a lot more to come where that came from. So how do we prepare to live in this coming age of vitriol? How do we respond to those who say that we who confess Christ are headed in to a long, dark night of cultural exile with no daylight in sight? Well, before we head down into our bunkers and collect our dry food stores, I would like to remind us that we are at a C.S. Lewis conference. That may seem obvious, but here's my point, if you'll take my meaning. We tend to romanticize the past, but we should remember that Lewis and Tolkien were doing their best work here at Oxford at the height of the bone-crunching period of analytic philosophy. A.J. Ayer and Gilbert Ryle walked these narrow lanes in this city of dreaming spires, and let's be honest, they were far more notable and acclaimed in the academic guild than any of the Inklings. But the last time I checked, there wasn't a conference going on here with anyone outside the academy celebrating the inspirational work of Ryle or Ayer or the countless lives that they reached. So can I be the silver lining guy in the midst of all of this cultural gloom and doom? What I would like to draw our attention to today is that there is a trend toward a different mood on the continent of Europe toward Christianity in certain significant circles of the intellectual class. It's a different tone than we might have seen 20 years ago, when Derrida was all of the rage. Now, what's the reason for this? Well, it is, to paraphrase D. Elton Trueblood, one can only live, and this goes back to Kelly Monroe Kohlberg's point, one can only live in a cut flower civilization for so long before one starts getting interested in going back to the roots. It's hard for Americans to see, but Europe is more advanced in its distance from this cultural legacy of the church. I love to talk to my colleagues teaching in Europe because what's it like to live in the future? And oddly, all of a sudden, key intellectuals seem to be missing the theology and ethics and intellectual imagination of the great Christian intellectual tradition. And I'd like to introduce you today to a few atheist philosophers from the continent currently working, major figures, who think that Christians are at their best not when they're trying to be flexible or relevant or innovative or doing constructive proposals, but when they are being the most orthodox. And I think that's what's happening is the beginnings of a longing for civilization, for culture, for home in a society that is rapidly approaching the 0 point. Isn't that what Monsieur Gustave in Grand Budapest Hotel is all about? What's his line? You see, there are still faint glimmers of civilization left in this barbaric slaughterhouse that was once known as humanity. As I've already mentioned before, many of us have grown bored with the debate between the new atheists and the traditional theists. Let's face it, it's a yawn fest. None of the kids that I know in college are paying any attention to this stuff anymore. Let's stop talking about it. The real action is between current continental philosophers who are reappropriating certain themes of Christian theism in sometimes surprising ways. So here's my thesis today. Despite their self-confessed atheism, secular theorists can seem to improve upon key ideas which they derive from the antithesis that they find in Orthodox Christian theology. So they wind up paraphrasing our concepts in fascinating, if slightly contradictory ways. Put more simply, they need us to be us. They need Christians to be Christian. To put it in the language of popular culture, for these theorists, Christianity is the long-lost girlfriend they could never get over. Their work is like one never-ending Bon Iver for Emma forever ago record. That is the period. Thank you. Somebody got that reference. Praise God. Now, over the course of this talk, I would like to adduce 4 examples into the record on this point. They are Slavoj Žižek, Peter Sloterdijk, Konton Miasu, this is an alphabet soup, and Julia Christieva. These are 4 of my favorites. 1 Slovenian, 1 German, and 2 French philosophers, respectively. All prominent theorists of our time, and we could adduce many others, including Badiou, Agamben, and Deleuze, but we don't have time for that today. So what I'll be endeavoring to show here, and permit me a guitar analogy at this point, is that the best licks that these philosophers have are stolen from the theologians. And mostly, they're pretty consciously aware of it. It's kind of like when Keith Richards met Chuck Berry for the first time. So let's start with the case of Žižek. Nowadays, you hear people buzzing about so-called Christian atheism. I saw a book over here on the table with that title. Now, even though he himself rejects that designation, people get the idea of Christian atheism from the writings of Žižek. Now, just for the record, let me repeat what I always say, which is Christian is the greatest of all possible nouns and the lamest of all possible adjectives. Slavoj Žižek is a thinker who fraternizes with theologians such as John Milbank and Creston Davis, and who knows his Bible stories better than most evangelicals. And yet, as a good Hegelian, he's always offering a negation of negation. So, for instance, he says things like this at the climax of his most recent film. The message of Christ, and you know, Žižek, he's got these tics, you know, he's like, oh, my God, he's always like this, oh, my God. The message of Christ is I'm dying, but my death itself is good news. The cry of dereliction from the cross is that you are left alone, left to your freedom. Be in the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, which is just the community of believers. It's wrong to think that the second coming will be that Christ as a figure will return somehow. Christ is already here when believers form an emancipatory collective. This is why I claim that the only way really to be an atheist is to go through Christianity. Christianity is much more atheist than the usual atheism, which can claim there is no God, but on the other side there is a certain trust in the big other. This big other can be called natural necessity, evolution, the state, or whatever. Now, clearly, this argument is provocative and quite comically misses the entire point of the gospel. But in a funny way, Žižek is saying the same thing that David Bentley Hart recently argued in his brilliant First Things essay entitled No Enduring City, in which he concluded that Christianity in its current socio-political expression naturally set the stage for atheism. Now, who is Žižek? I love saying that. Žižek. He's an apoplectic Slovenian theorist who, by any reasonable estimate, is the most recognized public philosopher of our time. He's called the Elvis of cultural theory. He's regularly featured in New York Magazine, the New York Review of Books, and the London Review of Books, for example. He has churned out over 50 serious academic volumes in the past 3 decades, the most recent of which is his over 1,200-page homage to Hegel, Marx, and Lacan, entitled Less Than Nothing, Hegel and the Shadow of Dialectical Materialism. He's also a film star, appearing in 3 iconic documentaries that outline his thought, including last fall's A Pervert's Guide to Ideology. I don't know if you saw on Netflix a couple of weeks ago, they added that film to Netflix, and Netflix had a scramble where they got the titles and the definitions of different films mixed up together, and I saw this one on my Netflix screen. I took a screen capture of it. Director Sophie Fiennes and philosopher Slavoj Žižek journey into the epicenter of ideology through their interpretations of a need to battle the Green Goblin. That actually happened. Actually, that was better than the actual film. I wish they would have made that film. That's the film they should have made. You can't make this stuff up. Zizek is a former presidential candidate in Slovenia, international director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, and a professor of philosophy and psychoanalysis at the European Graduate School. He was the high priest of Occupy Wall Street until he told the occupiers that they were more like the Tea Party than they were like the radical left. He's the court jester of the coming apocalypse, but somehow the joke always seems to be on us. To Zizek, all politics, from communist to social democratic, are formed not by deliberate principles of freedom or equality, but by expressions of repressed desires. Shame, guilt, and sexual insecurity. We're convinced we're drawing conclusions from an interpretable world when Zizek says actually what's happening is we're just suffering from involuntary psychic fantasies. His main theme is ideology. For Zizek, we are not so much living in a post-ideological age, as some would claim, postmodernism, as an era dominated by the ideology of cynicism. Adapting from Marx, ideology stems from cynicism. Simply stated, it's this, and here's a quote from Zizek. Those captive to an ideology know that deep down in their activity, they are following an illusion, but still they are doing it. I know this is an illusion, I know this isn't real, but I'm still going through the motions. Here's a quote from his film. It works. And this is how every ideology has to work. It's never just meaning. It also has to work as an empty container open to all possible meanings. It's, that gut feeling that we feel when we experience something pathetic and we say, oh my God, I'm so moved. There's something here that's so deep. But we never know what the depth is. It's a void. In light of this, here's where Zizek is his most ominous, the high priest of the coming apocalypse. He says his central theme is we are responsible for our dreams. Our dreams stage our desires, and our desires are not objective facts. We created them, we sustain them, and we will be held responsible for them. Now, several years ago, Zizek published a book called The Puppet and the Dwarf. And I bring this into the record because he goes to a great amount of length and detail talking about Lewis, Tolkien, and Chesterton in The Puppet and the Dwarf, and he loves them. He's one of the biggest Tolkien and Chesterton and Lewis fans that I know. And here is the irony. Zizek perceptively notes that the only people really enjoying themselves in today's nihilistic desert of the real are the Christians. They're the only people that seem to be having a good time. He observes, quote, the subversive sting of G.K. Chesterton's work is contained in the endless variation of one and the same matrix of the Hegelian paradoxical self-negating reversal. So, for example, what if in our postmodern world of ordained transgression, in which the marital commitment is perceived as being ridiculously out of date, those who cling to it are now the true subversives? What if today straight marriage is the most dark and daring of all transgressions, to quote Chesterton? He goes on to say, the atheist radical universe, deprived of religious reference, is the gray universe of egalitarian terror and tyranny. And listen to this passage in which Zizek praises Chesterton and Lewis for pointing out that paganism is not, quote, the joyful assertion of life, while Christianity imposes a somber order of guilt and renunciation. It is, on the contrary, that the pagan stance is deeply melancholic. Even as it preaches a pleasurable life, it is in the mode of enjoy it while it lasts, because in the end, death. The message of Christianity, on the contrary, Zizek says, is that of infinite joy beneath the deceptive surface of guilt and renunciation. Now, isn't that precisely the argument of the weight of glory that we heard last night? Zizek quotes Chesterton at this juncture, quote, "The outer ring of Christianity is the rigid guard of ethical abnegations and professional priests." That's what the world sees. "But inside that inhuman guard, you will find the old human life dancing like children and drinking wine like men. For Christianity is the only frame for pagan freedom." Zizek concludes, "Is not the Lord of the Rings the ultimate proof of this paradox? Only a devout Christian could have imagined such a magnificent pagan universe." Zizek seems to understand something that the church has forgotten, that there is a radical, subversive quality to Christianity that is extremely effective in subverting modern ideology. Example number 2, Peter Sloterdijk. Called the most erudite man living on the planet by the Los Angeles Review of Books, Peter Sloterdijk is a German professor of philosophy, a media theorist, and a popular television talk show host. He gained notoriety in 1983 for his bestseller, The Critique of Cynical Reason. In that work, Sloterdijk tackles the question of how to respond to this zeitgeist of cynicism. Remember, they're 20 years ahead of us. His answer is to return to the original cynic, Diogenes, who navigated the challenges of imperialism with a joyful embodied presence of minimalism, of possessions, and of ideas. As one reviewer has noticed, the early Sloterdijk reacted forcefully against Heidegger's late-in-life suggestion that only a God can save us now. Next, he sets to move past religion. He has a trilogy of books entitled Spheres, the first 2 of which have come out, and in English their titles are, of this trilogy, the first 2 in this trilogy are called Bubbles and You Must Change Your Life. Now, I'll forgive you if you think that these were books ghostwritten for Joel Osteen, but they're not. They're books by a very prominent German philosopher. As he explains in Bubbles, Sloterdijk sees the demise of religion as toxic for our culture. Make no mistake about it. It has created a greenhouse effect that has made the global context uninhabitable. People need to breathe in rich supplies of symbols, interpretations, and life practices. So if the whole earth is melting down, what do? We build air conditioning units. So what he says is that we need to find a new technological form of reasoning that air conditions us from this global meltdown. And these air conditioning units in our bubbles are derived mostly in Sloterdijk from Christian themes and sources. He just goes back to the tradition and says, well, the Christians were able to insulate themselves from the greenhouse effect of their times. This has sustained them. Adam Hirsch, writing for the New Republic, says this: "It's no coincidence that many of Sloterdijk's examples come from the iconography of Christianity, since religion has been man's best generator of spheres. What Sloterdijk hopes to do is retrieve religion's power to create intimacy while shearing it of its untenable dogmas. It will be advantageous," Sloterdijk writes, "for the free spirit to emancipate itself from the anti-Christian effect of recent centuries as a tenseness that is no longer necessary. Anyone seeking to reconstruct basic communal and communitary experiences needs to be free of anti-religious reflexes." So what is he saying? He's saying, stop getting so bent out of shape about the Christians. Get over it. Let them be them. Let them do their thing. Let's do our thing. We'll just steal all their ideas. And you see this happening. I mean, I don't know if you're hip to the School of Life that has been started by Alain de Botton, a British philosopher here. They have Church for Atheists. They have hymns. They sing songs. They have sermons. They have pews. Everything is set up just the same way. It's called the School of Life. Actually, they have desks instead of pews, which I think we would do well to go to that model too. Now, Sloterdijk's most recent book that just came out last fall is called You Must Change Your Life. It's a title he borrows from a Rilke poem, so he gets props from me for that. And he really gets underway with this proposal. He says, what is needed in our time is a new athleticism of asceticism. Now, there he sounds like Jesse Jackson. But an athleticism of asceticism, in which we will inhabit new liturgies that will make us competitive and strong in a world that can no longer look to religion for answers. And so he employs Nietzsche's phrase, ascetic planet. We need to reconstruct an ascetic planet, a planet of the practicing, which he calls anthropotechniques. So the question is, how does one go about building this ascetic planet? Well, Sloterdijk calls religion just a series of loquacious trances, so we can't just go back to religion, but yet he cheats and borrows on himself because he's torn on the issue of religion. He says, really, religions do not exist. Religions do not exist because anything can be a religion now. Sociologists will admit anything. He said, the key turning point for me in deciding there is no such thing as a sociology of religions is that they allowed Scientology to be called a religion. I mean, okay, it's over now, okay? Can we just admit that it's over? There are no religions. Sloterdijk says something that Lacan said a generation before. There is only one religion, and that is Christianity. That's the only one we've got left. So, he loves Karl Barth, he loves the doctrine of revelation, but he can't move himself to believe. So how do you build this ascetic planet? Well, he makes several suggestions, and 7 in fact, perfect number. But actually, in these 7 suggestions, what he does is he just goes back and raids the Christian tradition for ideas. So suggestion number 1, reforms or form secular monastic communities that inspire fitness and greatness of individuals. So we need new monasteries. Now, Sloterdijk calls out modern radicals for parodying and making fun of monasticism and asceticism. He's like, you idiots, this is precisely what we need. Hume was one that did this. He poked fun at monasticism. But Sloterdijk says, you fools, look at where the monasteries are built. They are built on the top of mountains. What have you done lately, you non-contributing zero? So new monastic communities, just not Christian ones. Second, he calls for virtue ethics and habit forming through the profession of teaching. But where does he go back to for ideas about this? To Aristotle and Aquinas to get ideas. They all understood that pedagogy is all important. Third, he says we must face death with bravery. We must learn to face death with bravery rather than be, right? This is what Eric was talking about at the very beginning. But where is his inspiration? He has beautiful passages on Christ's sayings from the cross, the tetelestai, it is finished. And he says, quote, it is a scriptural, messianic, athletic statement of immense achievement. The acrobatic revolution of Christianity does not end with the conquest of death's passion being demonstrated on the cross. The triumph of ability over non-ability takes place between Good Friday evening and Easter morning. The most pathos-laden of all time spent in this time, the slain Jesus carrying around the most unheard of fact, that of Akra Banin into hell. He walked through the underworld as on tiptoe. And with his resurrection on the 3rd day, anti-gravitation celebrates its greatest victory. It's as if Christ, the first among God's acrobats, has gotten hold of a vertical rope that opened the way for him and his followers to be absolutely vertical, previously closed, or only sensed mythically, unquote. Again, he admits Christianity has the better story. Fourth, he calls for the cessation of the self from the crowd. And who are his sources? Well, the Bible, Matthew 10:37. Anyone who loves his father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He says the New Testament has this genius of the individual that has become prioritized in the West. This is where you guys get this from. And he loves Kierkegaard, of course. Number 5, he advocates goal-directedness. And what's his first thing that he cites? 1 Corinthians 9:26. 6, he calls for, we need to recover the idea of metanoia, repentance, which he calls opportunistic turns. Thank you for laughing at that. I appreciate that, because I think it's funny too. This means openness to the notion that education means conversion. And he cites Paul's road to Damascus experience as fundamental to understanding what the West is about. And finally, he says, we need genuine discipleship. And where does he go? He goes to Comenius's 17th century notions of the reformation of schools and the imitation of Christ for his example for this. It's as if naturalism is playing a cruel joke on itself. It wants to be supernatural when it grows up. This reminds me of what someone asked Grant Morrison, the great graphic novelist, writer, comics writer, who kind of rebirthed new mythologies for the Superman myth and Batman myth and so forth. Someone once asked him recently at a conference, in your recent Batman and Robin series, how old is Batman? And Grant Morrison was like, what? Why are you asking this question? Why do you want fiction to be right like the real world? We have the real world. Stop asking those questions. By the way, that's why the Justice League film is going to be a disaster. Because there's no way to put Batman and Superman on the screen at the same time and have it make sense. It's supposed to be a fictional, it's supposed to be a comic book, not real action, not real life. All right, third example. French philosopher Quentin Miassou. Very nice, huh? He's a hip young philosopher, very young guy, just went to the Sorbonne. He has only got 2 books out so far, but he's all the rage. The books are After Finitude and The Number and the Siren. And for my money, he's written the most profound works of contemporary philosophy since Wittgenstein. What he's trying to do is trying to upend Kant's Copernican revolution in epistemology, with its shift to the individual as the locus of truth in the center of knowledge. He says, if that's true, if Kant's argument is correct, that the human being produces knowledge, then what you essentially are winding up saying is that there's no such thing as knowledge before Homo sapiens came to exist, which is nonsense. There has to be something before that. He rejects the notion that facticity is related to human reason, because according to his worldview, time and space preceded reason. So you can't have reason as being the basis for everything. This is where the naturalists go all weird. Reason doesn't come from material. It's a transcendental. So I love Miassou just admits this. Let's stop talking about reason as being the basis for everything. This is very reminiscent of David Hume. He says it's pure contingency and chance. He maintains in his book, After Finitude, quote, there is no reason for anything to be or to remain thus and so rather than otherwise, and this applies as much to the laws that govern to the world as the things of the world. Everything could actually collapse, from trees to stars, from stars to laws, from physical laws to logical laws, and this not by virtue of some superior law whereby everything is destined to perish, but by virtue of the absence of any superior law capable of preserving anything, no matter what, from perishing. So what does he say? There are no facts. There are only contingencies. So both the theologians are wrong and the mechanistic naturalists are wrong at the same time. So where does he go from there? What he says is that the old Aristotelian notion that in order to have a rational conversation, you must adhere to the principle of sufficient reason and the law of non-contradiction. Let's just face it, if we're true materialists, we have to throw that out. We have to throw reason out. Let's just go ahead and admit this, because the universe is based upon contingencies that we don't understand, and quantum physics is showing us this, according to Miyasu. So, to wit, and you guys that are into the creation-evolution debate will love this, Miyasu says that based upon Darwinian natural selection, the law of non-contradiction must not be the case, because the principle of sufficient reason is not substantiated by ancestral history. So what's he saying? He's saying it's impossible. It really is too incredible to believe that life came from non-life. So there has to be there's no reason for that to happen. We live in a universe that is governed by some sort of super chaos. So there's no sufficient reason to believe that organic life would come from inorganic life. He says it's a miracle that we're conscious and that we can recognize it. It's contingency at its purest. Now, some of you might be wondering, how does this all fit into our theme of how Christian theology and virtue ethics inspire someone like him? Well, here's what he says. He says the most troubling problem for modern philosophy is that human beings are haunted by what he calls, and this is a chapter title that he wrote, the spectral dilemma. The fact that we carry around dead people with us. We remember them. We're haunted by their lives and legacies. What do we do with that? How do we answer this question of suffering? Well, he says that the theologians can deal with this, but we can't. So what do we have to do in order to say that somehow those who have gone before us, who we loved, who we want to honor, and who we want to keep with us forever, how are they going to be remembered after we die? You know what Miyasu says? Perhaps God is possible. If we live in a universe of pure contingency, maybe God could come into being too and hold together all these things that haunt us. Secondly, and I'll hurry through this, in The Number and the Siren, he's focused on this theme of contingency, and he quotes this poem by Stefan Mallarmé called A Throw of the Dice. And he says, what is the fundamental governing problem of philosophy? Going all the way back to Plato. What is the definition of philosophy according to Plato? It is a meditation upon and a preparation for death. So what is the fundamental problem that philosophy must solve? Dying. How do we get past this problem of death? So, if we live in a universe of pure contingency, the next thing that Miyasu proposes after the possibility of God is an atheistic resurrection of the dead. Maybe that will sort everything out. That's the next big thing. Fourthly and finally, Yulia Christieva. She is a brilliant semiotician, a professor of philosophy at the University of Paris Diderot, and a leading figure in the history of structuralism and feminism. She's an unlikely candidate to have written the 2011 book entitled The Incredible Need to Believe. The English edition, published by Columbia University Press, reveals Christieva in full conversation with Western Christianity in general and Catholicism in particular. She sees the humanist tradition of which she takes part as a direct derivation from the Christian West's emphasis on criticism and constant reformation. And for this reason, Christieva says, don't be afraid of Christianity. The theologians are your best friend. the Archbishop, and yes, even the Pope. She has a huge crush on J2P2. Unlike the cartoonish Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Pinker, Christieva seems to want to calm people down on the radical left with chapter titles such as From Jesus to Mozart, Why Christianity is Different. Suffering, Lenten lectures, which she was invited to give by the Archbishop of Paris at the Cathedral at Notre Dame. The Genius of Catholicism. And finally, her final chapter in this book, The Incredible Need to Believe, Don't be afraid of European culture. Specifically, when it comes to John Paul's defense of the faith, Christieva admires his resolve and bravery in the face of not only totalitarian threat, but as his body was racked in agony toward the end of his life, he was out there confronting the public and saying, this, remember this? This is a greater media spectacle than anything that Hollywood can produce. And she says this, we need to learn from this man. Despite our sincere disagreements with him, quote, we would have liked for him to be an apostle of women, of contraceptives, of sexual liberty, of condoms, and of homosexuals. But this was to ask him to break with his tradition and his own convictions. This theatrical man was nothing if he could not be a true Catholic, capable nonetheless of revealing to us the genius of Catholicism because he himself had the genius of incarnate speech. I commend that book to you. So where do we go from here? Practical steps, and then let's talk together. I too, like Lou Marcos, come from a Baptist tradition, so I have 3 points, but I'll make them very brief because, as I was saying to someone earlier, the first time I ever preached in public, my father got right down in my face. I was 14 years old. I had no business preaching. But he got in my face and said, son, there are 2 rules you have to remember about preaching. 1, the brain can only contain what the bottom can endure. And number 2, if you can't strike oil in half an hour or less, quit boring people. So very quickly, 3 points. Reclaim. We really do need to spend a vast amount of time, individually, all of us, recovering the tradition, reading church history. We are reminded of what Chesterton said. It's my favorite quote from Chesterton. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. It allows the most underprivileged class of all a chance to have a vote in our affairs. Our ancestors. We have no right to tinker with the tradition. We are not in a position to revise the wisdom of the ancients on theology or marriage or anything else. We are not better than them. And since we're in the UK, I would remind us, for those of you that have been Protestants and have been feeling left out by all the references to J2P2 in this talk, I would remind us that Martin Lloyd-Jones, at the zenith of his ministry at Westminster Chapel in London, just a couple of blocks there from Buckingham Palace, thousands of people coming to hear him preach on a regular basis. He was the only minister of that church. Now that's inconceivable to us these days. So he finally decided, you know what? I need to staff up. And so he hired his first staff position. Do you know who Martin Lloyd-Jones hired for his first staff? Surely being maybe an administrator or a minister of music or maybe somebody who worked with the kids. No. He hired E.N. Murray to teach church history on Sunday afternoons. That's what we need. We have no chance of winning the respect of those with whom we fundamentally disagree through innovative proposals or looking over our collective left shoulders. There is no other way for us than to redig our Father's wells. Secondly, we need to reply. We need to be engaged with the world of contemporary philosophy. we don't do a good job with this. But here I would point us to Lewis's example and to an uncomfortable moment in Lewis's life that we don't talk about very much. Shh, the Elizabeth Anscombe affair. Remember that? He got his head handed to him. She gave a withering critique of his critique of naturalism. Now, what did Lewis do? Did he act all hurt and, bent out of shape and double down? No. He revised miracles and incorporated her critique into his work. We need to learn from C.S. Lewis's humility. If our secular counterparts sense in us a genuineness of the search for truth, who knows what is possible? And finally, we must re-enchant this generation with the animating ideals that made Western civilization in general great. That is why we are all ultimately here, right? Our imaginations were re-enchanted by reading Lewis and Tolkien and any other of the Inklings. Remember that magnificent pagan universe of which Zizek spoke? It could only have been built by the mind of a Tolkien. Narnia only comes from the mind of Lewis. That's why the Golden Compass is so lame. They felt free. Lewis and Tolkien felt free to immerse themselves in Nordic and pagan Greek myth and come up with an alternative creation myth because they knew that there was a creator. Here is what I believe we believe. That these dreaming spires land their punches. They will have an impact and effect if we will let them speak. And we need to be reminded of that phrase of Flannery O'Connor, we live, we walk. Now, she talked about the South, but I think this is the West. It is a Christ-haunted landscape. And our job is to keep haunting the West. And to remind them of that great phrase from John Updike, who went to the Ruskin School just across the street here. We need to get people to the point where they think, perhaps we have believed the lie and may be crushed in remonstrance. And just to close, we must be reminded that even a figure like Nietzsche could not get over the monstrous beauty of Christian art. If any of you read Krzysztof Michalski's The Flame of Eternity, published last fall, he said, we must see Nietzsche not as a philosopher, but as a poet. He was a tortured soul who was enraptured by Bach's St. Matthew's Passion and Raphael's Transfiguration. The one who wrote Zarathustra did it after the style of the Gospels and apocalyptic literature. And as he descended into insanity in his asylum, his peroration on his letters was the crucified one, Friedrich Nietzsche. As Tamsin Shaw writes about Michalski's masterpiece in the New York Review of Books, quote, Nietzsche remained throughout his same life a severe critic of religious illusions, but for all that he proclaimed his resilience in the face of hard truths, he could not reconcile himself to the fading of what he calls in human, all too human, the rainbow colors at the outermost ends of human knowing and imagining. Friends, let us re-enchant the imaginations who find themselves on common ground with us on pagan planets. Let us resolve to meet them there, where Nietzsche's confidence finally was exhausted, at the outermost ends, the rainbow colors of human knowing and imagining. Thank you very much.